I learned long ago that the most painful moments in life are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive quietly, dressed in politeness, hiding behind dinner plates and polite smiles. At 72, I had endured loss, sacrifice, and loneliness, but nothing prepared me for the night I realized I had become invisible in my own family. Not forgotten, worse, observed, judged, and quietly dismissed. The dining room glowed with warm yellow light that evening, the kind meant to suggest comfort and belonging. Hardwood floor beneath the table reflected the chandelier overhead, and the smell of roasted meat filled the air. Everything about the setting suggested family, stability, and success. Anyone walking past the windows would have assumed this was a happy home. I once believed it was. I sat at the table with my hands folded loosely in my lap, watching as my daughter moved between the kitchen and dining room, adjusting plates that were already aligned, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from the tablecloth. She was nervous. I could tell by the way her movements lacked rhythm, by the way her eyes avoided mine. I told myself it was nothing. I had been making excuses for years. Her husband sat comfortably across from me, leaning back in his chair, one arm resting confidently along the table. He wore a pressed button-down shirt and an expensive watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. His phone lay beside his plate, screen lighting up every few minutes with notifications he never ignored. He liked to be seen as important, busy, above small conversations and smaller people. Dinner began politely enough. Compliments about the food, casual remarks about work and traffic. I listened more than I spoke, as I usually did. Over time, I had learned that my words no longer carried the same weight in that house. When I spoke, conversations paused awkwardly before resuming without me. When I stayed quiet, no one seemed to notice. Halfway through the meal, his attention turned fully toward me. I felt it before he spoke, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. So he said casually, cutting into his food, "What did you end up doing today?" I looked up. "Just took a walk, read a bit." He smiled thinly. "That's it?" I nodded. "That's enough for me." He chuckled, not kindly. "Must be nice to have that kind of freedom." My daughter stiffened. I saw her grip her fork a little tighter. "I worked my whole life," I said calmly. "I earned some quiet." He shook his head slowly, like a man disappointed by a child. "That's one way to look at it. Another way is wasting time." The room went still. Even the sound of cutlery seemed to fade. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. That silence cut deeper than his words. "I just don't understand," he continued, leaning back. "How someone can sit around all day and feel okay contributing nothing." I felt my chest tighten, but my voice remained steady. "Contribution isn't always visible." He laughed outright this time. "That sounds like something people say when they don't have much to show." My daughter looked down at her plate. She didn't say a word. I waited for her to defend me. I waited for her to remind him who I was. She didn't. "This house costs money," he went on, gesturing around him. "Utilities, maintenance, groceries, everything adds up. We all have responsibilities." I followed his gesture slowly, my eyes tracing the walls, the floors, the ceiling. I remembered when the house smelled like fresh paint, when the floors were bare wood, when this place was nothing more than a long-term risk everyone else was afraid to take. "I don't ask for much," I said quietly. "That's not the point," he replied sharply. "The point is you're living here without adding value, another word he liked to use. And at your age," he added, lowering his voice just enough to sound reasonable, "being dependent isn't a good look." Dependent, my daughter's chair shifted slightly. Still, she said nothing. I placed my fork down carefully. "If you have something to say, say it plainly." He didn't hesitate. "Fine, plainly, you're useless here." The word landed heavy, ugly, undeniable. My daughter inhaled sharply but stayed silent. That was when I knew something inside our family had broken. "You should be grateful," he continued, emboldened by the lack of resistance, "that we let you stay. Most people your age don't get that luxury. Let you stay." I nodded slowly, absorbing the words, the entitlement, the assumption beneath them. "I understand," I said quietly. He mistook my calm for defeat. "Good," he replied, "because things can't stay like this forever." I stood, pushing my chair back gently. "I'm done eating." No one stopped me in my room. I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt hostile. Across the room stood the old wardrobe I'd carried through 3 moves. Inside it, behind coats and boxes, rested a thin leather folder I hadn't opened in years. I took it out and sat on the bed. Inside were documents most people never think about until it's too late. Deeds, records, proof of ownership and intention. Proof of a life built quietly, deliberately, without applause. I stared at the papers and felt something settle inside me, not anger, not revenge. Resolve. He believed I lived there because I had nowhere else to go. He believed the house was his success story. He believed silence meant weakness, and my daughter, whether out of fear or exhaustion, had allowed him to believe it. That night, as laughter drifted faintly from the living room, I made a decision. I would not argue, I would not beg for dignity, I would wait. Because the truth, when revealed at the right moment, doesn't need volume, it only needs timing. The days after that dinner moved slowly, weighed down by an unspoken understanding that something had shifted permanently. I woke early as I always had, long before the rest of the house stirred, and moved through the quiet rooms with care, as if I were a guest afraid of making noise. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning spray, the counters spotless, the order forced. I made my breakfast alone and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood come alive, wondering when exactly I had crossed the line from father to inconvenience. Silence followed me everywhere now, not the peaceful kind I once enjoyed, but the tense kind that presses against your ears and reminds you that you are no longer welcome in conversations meant to include you. He grew bolder in the days that followed, not loud, not openly cruel, but precise. Comments slipped into casual conversation about bills going up, about how things were tighter than people realized, about how everyone needed to be realistic as they got older. He never addressed me directly at first, always speaking to my daughter while I sat within arm's reach, close enough to hear every word, far enough to be ignored. She nodded along, tired, distracted, offering small murmurs of agreement that felt heavier than outright condemnation. Each nod felt like another brick laid between us. One afternoon, as I sat reading in the living room, he stood in the doorway speaking on the phone, his voice low but sharp. He talked about long-term planning, about aging parents who refused to see reason, about how some people had to be pushed before they became permanent problems. He didn't lower his voice when he noticed me listening. He didn't need to, the message was meant to be heard. When he hung up, he glanced at me briefly, his expression flat, then walked away as if the conversation had never happened. That evening, my daughter finally spoke to me alone in the kitchen. Her voice was soft, careful, like she was walking across thin ice. She said he was stressed, that work was demanding, that money worried him more than he admitted. Then she said it might be time for me to think about other arrangements in the future, something smaller, something more suitable. She didn't say forced, but the word hung between us. I looked at her face, at the woman I had raised, and realized how tired she was, how worn down by years of compromise. I told her I understood. It was easier than telling her the truth, that her silence hurt more than his words ever could. From that point on, the pressure became routine. Articles left on the counter about downsizing and retirement, casual mentions of assisted living framed as concern, jokes about how independence fades whether people like it or not. Each comment chipped away at the illusion that this was temporary. They were building a case against my presence, and they were doing it patiently, confidently, as if the outcome were already decided. I began taking longer walks, staying out later not because I wanted to leave, but because it hurt less than sitting in a house where I had become invisible. One morning, he confronted me directly. He stood across from me in the living room, arms crossed, posture firm, the look of a man rehearsed in control. He said we needed to talk about timelines, about responsibility, about the future. He said this arrangement couldn't go on forever. I agreed with him calmly, and that agreement unsettled him. He had expected resistance, fear, maybe even pleading. Instead, he found none. I told him drifting helped no one, and that statement stayed with him longer than he wanted it to. I could see it in the way his eyes narrowed, in the way his confidence wavered for just a moment before snapping back into place. That night, I lay awake thinking about how easily people rewrite history when it suits them. He saw the house as a reward for his ambition, proof of his success. He saw my presence as charity, not legacy. He never asked how this place came to be, never wondered who paid for what, never questioned why stability existed before he arrived. And my daughter, shielded for years from the weight of my sacrifices, now stood in the middle, unsure which truth to face. As I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling around me, I understood something clearly for the first time. Silence had not kept the peace. It had only given permission, and soon, very soon, that permission would be revoked. By the time the third week passed, I no longer wondered whether they wanted me gone. The question had shifted to how and when. The house had taken on a strange rhythm, one that moved without me, around me, as if I were already a memory walking through familiar rooms. Conversations stopped when I entered. Decisions were made without consulting me. Even simple routines, meals, errands, plans unfolded as if my presence were incidental, temporary, something to be managed until resolved. I had lived long enough to recognize when people were preparing an exit for someone they no longer wanted to confront directly. He began asserting control in ways so subtle they would have been easy to miss if I hadn't been paying attention. Cabinets were rearranged. My chair at the dining table was shifted slightly farther from the center. The thermostat was adjusted without discussion, then justified with comments about efficiency. He spoke more often about his house, about how much work he put into maintaining it, about sacrifices he made to keep everything running. Each statement was designed to reinforce a single idea. This place belonged to him now, and I was merely occupying space he allowed. One afternoon, I returned from a walk to find a stack of papers on the kitchen counter. Utility statements, insurance renewals, a printed spreadsheet outlining monthly expenses. He stood beside them, arms folded, waiting. He said it was important I understood the financial reality. He spoke slowly, carefully, like a manager explaining costs to an underperforming employee. He pointed to numbers, to increases, to projections. Then he looked at me and said it wasn't sustainable for one person to carry all of this alone. He didn't say my name, he didn't need to. The implication was clear. I listened without interrupting, nodded once, and thanked him for explaining. My calm unsettled him. He had wanted discomfort. He had wanted submission. That night after they went to bed, I sat at the small desk in my room and opened the leather folder again. I didn't rush, I didn't skim. I reviewed every document carefully, tracing dates, signatures, and legal language with the same discipline I had used decades earlier when I first built my life. Ownership, transfer clauses, contingencies, the will, everything was in order. More importantly, everything was still mine to control. I realized then how dangerous assumptions can be when they are built on ignorance. He had mistaken patience for weakness, generosity for surrender, silence for absence. He had no idea how thoroughly he misunderstood the situation. The following day, I made several quiet calls, professional, polite, efficient. I asked for confirmations, updates, and copies. I was addressed with respect, with familiarity, with an ease that reminded me who I had been long before I was reduced to a problem in my daughter's home. No one questioned my authority. No one spoke down to me. No one doubted my clarity. When I hung up, I felt something steady return to my chest, not pride, grounding. At dinner that evening, he announced plans without looking at me, renovations, changes, long-term adjustments. He spoke as though I were already absent. My daughter nodded along again, exhaustion written across her face. When she glanced at me, her eyes flickered with guilt, but she said nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't choosing sides, she was choosing survival, and that understanding, painful as it was, gave me clarity instead of resentment. Later, as I passed through the hallway, I overheard him speaking to her behind a closed door. His voice was low, urgent, confident. He talked about timelines again. About how situations like this only get harder the longer you wait. About how people my age resist change even when it's necessary. He said it would be kinder to act sooner rather than later. Kinder. I stood there long enough to hear her sigh, long enough to hear her say she didn't know what else to do. Then I walked away quietly, my decision already made. The next morning I left the house early and didn't explain where I was going. When I returned that evening, he looked genuinely surprised to see me. He asked where I had been. I told him I was handling personal affairs. He smirked and said it was good I was finally taking responsibility. I smiled faintly and agreed. Responsibility, after all, was exactly what I was exercising. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how power shifts long before it is announced. The moment someone believes they own you is the moment they stop protecting themselves from the truth. He believed the house was his. He believed the future belonged to him. He believed my silence meant consent. And because of that belief, he was careless, confident, unprepared. The will was already written. The documents were already secured. The truth was already positioned where it could not be ignored or softened. All that remained was timing. And soon, very soon, the man who humiliated me in front of my own daughter would learn the difference between living in a house and owning the ground beneath it. The day everything unraveled did not begin with drama. It began quietly, the way most irreversible moments do. I woke early, dressed carefully, and moved through the house without speaking. There was a calm in me that surprised even myself. No shaking hands, no racing thoughts, just certainty. The kind that only comes when a man knows the truth is finally about to stand on its own. By mid-morning, the house filled with tension disguised as normalcy. My daughter moved nervously, straightening cushions, wiping surfaces that were already clean. Her husband paced, checking his phone repeatedly, irritated by the disruption to his schedule. Neither of them asked why I had requested this gathering. Neither of them imagined what was coming. We sat in the living room, the same space where I had been spoken over, dismissed, and slowly erased. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the furniture he liked to boast about to guests. He sat confidently, arms crossed, already impatient. My daughter sat rigidly beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. I took my time before speaking. Silence has weight when it is no longer afraid. When I finally reached for the leather folder, his expression shifted slightly, curiosity, not concern. He still believed this was a conversation he controlled. I opened the folder and removed the first document, placing it carefully on the table. Then another. Then another. The sound of paper against glass filled the room. He leaned forward, frowning, scanning the pages. His confidence wavered just barely. He asked what this was about, irritation creeping into his voice. I told him calmly that he was looking at the ownership history of the house. He laughed once, short and dismissive, until he read further, dates, signatures, legal language. His smile faded. I explained slowly, clearly, without emotion. I told him I purchased the house outright decades ago, long before he entered my daughter's life. I told him every renovation, every improvement, every ounce of stability he enjoyed had been built on my decisions, my money, my risk. I told him transferring certain rights to my daughter was done for her protection, not his entitlement. As I spoke, the room changed. My daughter's eyes widened, realization crashing over her like a wave. She looked at the papers, then at me, then at him. Her silence finally broke, not with words, but with understanding. He interrupted me then, his voice sharp, defensive, insisting there had to be a mistake. He said this wasn't possible, that he would have known. I reminded him that he never asked, that he assumed, that arrogance often survives on unanswered questions. I slid the final document across the table, the will clear, updated, unambiguous, his name absent entirely. The air left his lungs slowly. He sat back, stunned, eyes darting as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. My daughter stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor, disbelief and hurt etched across her face. She asked why I never told her. I told her the truth, that I wanted her marriage to be built on respect, not leverage, and that I never imagined silence would be used as a weapon against me. Her husband tried to speak, but no sound came out. The man who once called me useless now struggled to form words. I stood then, not towering, not threatening, just present. I told him he had mistaken kindness for weakness, patience for surrender. I told him he was never the provider he believed himself to be. I told him that respect is not something you demand from people you think are beneath you. It is something you earn long before you need it. He stared at me, stripped of authority, stripped of certainty, finally seeing me not as an inconvenience, but as the foundation beneath his feet. No one raised their voice. There was no shouting, no anger, no satisfaction. Only truth standing where arrogance once lived. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted so completely that there was no path back to the man he thought he was. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence belonged to me. The days that followed the reading of the will were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches echoing through the house, no desperate attempts to argue facts that were now immovable. Power, once stripped away, tends to leave silence behind it. He moved differently after that day, slower, careful, as if every step needed permission. The confidence that once filled rooms ahead of him now lingered somewhere behind his eyes, unsure of where it was allowed to exist. My daughter, on the other hand, seemed lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter because the truth had finally surfaced. Heavier because that truth demanded she confront years of silence she could no longer excuse. He avoided me at first, not out of anger, but embarrassment. I saw it in the way he lingered in doorways, in the way his voice softened when he spoke in my presence, in the way he stopped making declarations about the house, the future, or what made sense. The man who once told me I should be grateful to stay there now understood how fragile his position truly was. Ownership has a way of clarifying reality. It removes illusion without raising its voice. My daughter came to me one evening after dinner, standing awkwardly near the doorway of my room like she used to when she was a child afraid of disappointing me. She apologized then, not quickly, not defensively, but slowly, with tears she didn't try to hide. She apologized for her silence, for allowing comfort to outweigh courage, for choosing peace at the expense of my dignity. I told her I forgave her not because it was easy, but because holding onto resentment would only poison what little time we had left together. Forgiveness didn't erase the hurt, but it made space for something better to grow. As for him, he tried to apologize too. His words were clumsy, careful, weighed down by the knowledge that apology does not restore authority. He spoke about stress, about pressure, about fear of failure. I listened because listening costs nothing. When he finished, I told him something he did not expect. I told him respect is not something that can be negotiated after it is lost. It is something built daily, long before power ever comes into question. Whether he rebuilt that respect was not for me to decide. It would show in time or it wouldn't. The house itself felt different after that. Not because the furniture changed or because anyone moved out immediately, but because the air was honest. Conversations no longer danced around unspoken assumptions. I no longer felt the need to shrink myself to maintain balance. I moved freely through rooms I had once tiptoed through. I sat where I pleased. I spoke when I wanted. The house remembered who it belonged to, and in doing so reminded everyone else. Eventually, arrangements were made, not rushed, not forced. My daughter needed time to decide what her marriage would look like without illusions propping it up. I needed time to enjoy the peace I had reclaimed. There was no triumph in any of it, only resolution. The kind that comes when truth replaces tension. I still wake early. I still drink my coffee by the window. I still take my walks through the neighborhood where people greet me with the same quiet respect they always have. The difference now is internal. I no longer question my worth. I no longer tolerate being diminished for the comfort of others. Age has taken many things from me: strength, speed, certainty about how much time remains, but it has given me clarity. And clarity is a powerful thing. In the end, the will was not about property or money. It was about boundaries. It was about teaching a lesson I should have taught sooner, that silence should never be mistaken for consent and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. I did not reclaim my dignity that day. I simply stopped letting anyone else decide where it belonged.